We have been dwelling in Paul's words from 2 Corinthians 4. Let us hear them one more time. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as we have been journeying through Lent, we've been using that imagery of having this treasure in clay jars, and we've been talking about clay jars. Each time we gather, we've been drawing on the imagery of God stooping it down into the creation, taking up the dust of the earth, forming it, then breathing life into it, creating it. Remembering that we are also dust, and to dust we shall return. Remembering who we are, creatures formed and loved by God, and that God entrusts into us the richness, the heritage, the joy of the gospel. And then we've been talking about, so what's it look like? Well, we've talked about Samson, Pua, Hosea, Esther. We've talked about these wonderful biblical characters who God has used to do mighty things. Well, sometimes the clay jars are folks who don't get along, too. And that's where we're going today. We're going to talk about the reality of the messiness of life, and that there are times that church members do not get along. I don't know, have you ever heard anything like that? Whoa! Never! The reality is in pre-marriage counseling, I will say to a couple, if I would lock you up in a totally circular white room with everything being white, it's just a matter of time before you disagree about something in the room. It's just reality. We humans are wired that way. We have opinions. And when we have opinions, eventually they might just clash. And sometimes it's not good. An image I thought of that seemed to speak to me was the idea of the old milk guy who would show up at somebody's home and they'd have jars of milk. And here's this wonderful container. It's got this little metal holder, but you still hear the jars clinking against each other. The issue there is that the jars are competing for that same space when they clink. If you take a bunch of terracotta clay pots and are moving them around, you're going to hear them clink. And the problem is that if they clink hard enough, they can break. When they're competing for the same space, when their opinions are bouncing off each other, wanting to be right, sometimes the clay pots can break. And so it is with Christian community. Sometimes when the disagreements are banging against each other, both claiming to be right, it can be harmful to the whole, to the body. So Paul helps us some with this. Paul helps us by naming names. Now, I want you to note as I read this that the only reason we hear these two individuals' names is because they've got a quarrel going on. And they are remembered in church history now for some 2,000 years. They're not known for their cooking or their attractiveness or the nice things they did. They are remembered because they had an argument. So from Philippians chapter 4, Paul writes, it's toward the end of his letter, and he says, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Euodia and Syntyche, two women who are important to Paul. So a couple things to take note of in there. Paul is not condemning them or joining on either side. He rather lifts them up to the church. Remember, the letter is to the whole congregation. And Paul is speaking to the whole congregation, work together on this. Help these two. He lifts up that they have been co-workers in the gospel, that they have walked with him and journeyed with him in spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. But for whatever reason, right now, they're not getting along. What would happen if Sherry Black said that the color on the altar for today was to be hot pink? And Vera Danner said, no, it is to be brown. Well, it wouldn't take long in our community that if you were really serious about it, well, maybe Sherry's sisters would start agreeing with her. Yeah, we think it should be hot pink. Well, and then I think Dorn would say, Mama, I agree it should be brown. And it would go from there to the point where there would be division. Paul lifts up to them what matters most is Jesus Christ crucified and risen. That's what unites us, and what unites us is stronger than what can separate us. Our personal opinions on things sometimes don't matter in the big scheme. Here, Paul values these two women. Now, we know very little about them. We know that they're most likely Greek in origin. Philippi was a Roman colony where free Romans and Greeks were living. It was a center of commerce. We know that he went there and he met Lydia, the seller of purple cloth, and then it kind of exploded from there. He baptized her household, and then the church was formed there. These two women are an integral part of that church, and by them being listed as co-workers in the gospel, they had a leadership role. And they're disagreeing, and it's not good for the whole body of the church. Paul draws them back to be able to say, let's work together on this, to heal the breach, to heal the relationship, to get back to what really matters, because each of them are a person for whom Jesus Christ has died and been risen. Jesus didn't love Eudia more than Syntyche. He loved both of them the same. And what's uniting for them is stronger than anything that can divide them. We don't know what happened in the long run, but we believe that there was healing in their relationship. Healing because the church walked together, lifting up what mattered most. If we really had a division over hot pink or brown on the altar, it really wouldn't matter, would it? So many times we will get hung up on things. We will harbor feelings. We will register what somebody has done and we remember it in the back of our minds. We might even hold on to something for decades. You ever know anybody that's held on to something for decades? Yeah. Paul's word to us, as we are imperfect clay jars, is to remind us we are formed by God. That God the potter formed us, and God the potter loves us, and God the potter knows that we have opinions. Yet God has entrusted to you and to me the fullness, the richness, the treasure of the gospel. There's not a single person on the face of the earth for whom Christ has not died and been risen. Christ has died and been risen for every single human that ever exists. And so then, freed by that treasure of God's love, we can now focus on loving like Jesus, speaking the truth in love, and when we have disagreements, not allowing it to divide us, but working through prayer, conversation, and for our own tempered spirits to be able to step back and say, I don't always have to be right. If we always have to be right, that means somebody always has to be wrong. And how's that work in a relationship? God has entrusted the gospel to us, healing the relationship between us and God, and opening the way so we can carry that treasure into our relationship with the rest of God's people. May we heed Paul's words. What might there be in your life that God is calling you to heal? As you, too, like me, aren't that different from Eudias and Syntyche. May we be those clay jars that bear the treasure. Amen.